Open the podcast bay doors, Hal.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 118 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. Author John Mulhall and I have about an hour's worth of conversation to get to, so let's get right into it. If you've been listening, John and I had differing theories on who was the primary/original personality, and as that was answered in this episode, John starts off claiming his victory.
Do we ever make a bet about Steven or Mark being the... because I feel like I want to cash in on something, like a pizza or...
All right, well, give me your address. I'll get some pizza delivered to you.
I'm kidding.
We'll get to that most definitely. But first, before things even get started, we get all the previously on, and then it goes into the Marvel logo, and... just something I noted, it just kind of struck me. This episode and episode 2 are the only ones that actually used Marvel's music.
Yeah.
Rather than some sort of other song to play as that logo is up.
Do you think there's anything to that, or is it just purely an episode by episode creative choice?
I'm not sure. I think it might be a little bit of each. I think that there might be a creative choice to not have it every single episode to try to make sure that things are a little different from episode to episode. But I wonder if there is any specific choice on which episodes it is. If they specifically say, okay, we need to have it for at least 2 episodes, and it should be this one and this one, or...
You mean like it's a production mandate, or like before they even start going through, hey, we need to have this on a couple, we need to have the Marvel logo on a couple of these episodes at least?
It could be a creative decision purely.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I wonder if we'll ever get any behind the scenes insight into that.
They do those Marvels Assembled after a show is over.
Yeah.
That gives a lot of behind-the-scenes type stuff, but that's not something they've discussed in any of the ones that I've watched so far.
No, and I was actually really hoping that they would with WandaVision, because there was a lot of conversation around the way that she says previously on WandaVision. It changes over the course of the show.
Yeah.
And I thought, that would be interesting if someone brought that up as a, we talked about this, and they don't really seem to go there much with the trappings of the show. It becomes, much more production focused, but inquiring minds want to know.
So after the Marvel logo, we get these weird little quick shots. We'll learn later what their significance is, but at the time, it's just, we see this cave filling up with water, a boy yelling for help, then a woman saying, "It's all your fault." And then it goes into where we left last episode with Tauret and Steven and Mark in the hall, all screaming.
Yeah.
And then we cut once again, going back to the therapy session with Mark.
Yeah, and Dr. Harrow.
Yeah, so it's a real jarring beginning where we're just cut until we're back in the therapy session. So it was very disorienting to start off.
Yes.
Which obviously I think was done on purpose.
Yeah, it puts us in kind of his mindset as we're confused about what things we should be focused on, just like he is. So works.
Yeah. And so we finally get back to the therapy session with Dr. Harrow. And at this point in the show, do you feel like this Harrow is a villain? Is working against him? Or what are your feelings at this point?
Well, I'll tell you, after this episode, I went down the rabbit hole a little bit more than I have on any of the other episodes. Because I don't know if the asylum in totality is a part of his mental break. That the Harrow in here is a reflection of the real world Harrow, which seems to be what people are leaning toward, or if this is the real Harrow and the show has been built kind of around the asylum. I don't know. I wonder after this episode, and really love this episode, but I wonder how they're going to wrap this show up. Because I feel like for as many answers as we got, we went deeper into the rabbit hole, and we have a long way to go, ostensibly, to wrap it up, either direction they choose. So I don't know if this is a villain. I mean, he seems to be, the words that he's using and the tone that he's using seems to be kind. He seems to be patient. To me, it doesn't seem overtly nefarious or, suspicious. There's no little looks. There's no melodramatic pauses. He seems like a therapist. If we were watching a different show, I would have no sense of malevolence coming from this character. So I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe it's just because of who Harrow is in the other world, in what we think of as being the real world.
Yeah.
But up until a little later in the episode, from what we saw of this Dr. Harrow in the previous episode and then including up to this point, I assumed that he was there to convince Mark that this is all happening in his head and to kind of trap him in this mental asylum construct.
Yeah.
And so that was my feeling towards Harrow, like I said, last episode and continuing up till this point, and even going further. I'll mention when that shifts.
Okay.
But at this point, I was still thinking that he, in both incarnations, is the villain of this piece.
Well, see, I think where you and I part is I wouldn't use the word villain. I definitely would use the word antagonist.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a little bit of a difference there, because for Mark in the asylum, the antagonist is the person that's keeping him away from his fantasies, right? Whatever the doctor's purpose is, whether he's trying to trap him there or actually help him, he's at loggerheads with Mark. So in the real world, those loggerheads are very clear. There's a dynamic there that's, and you could definitely apply the word villain there, I think, because his in game is in a way world destruction, or at least partial world destruction. So, there's big stakes there. But either way, Mark is running up against this person and they are at cross purposes. So he's definitely an antagonist to him in that sense. But I mean, if you look at other psychological stories that have been told, that the doctor is always going to feel like the heavy because they're trying to push you one way. And as a mental patient, you're trying to push against them the other way. So I don't know. I don't know if it's any, like, I didn't look at him and go, wow, he's really got a plan here and he's evil. It was just much more like Mark doesn't like him and retreats because he's pushing him to go to a place he doesn't want to go.
Right. Like I said, I kind of felt if you start from the belief that the real world is the real world and the asylum is the dream.
Yeah.
I've seen enough other stories in the past where there is some manifestation that is trying to keep you trapped inside and trying to keep you away from the real world.
Right.
And so that's what I thought Dr. Harrow was in this story for, like I said, last episode and most of this episode.
Well, I'd be very curious to hear where your shift comes. I'd be very curious to know what that is.
Yeah, well, we'll get there. So moving along, this conversation between Mark and Dr. Harrow leads to Harrow asking about the little boy, which apparently in this world they had been talking about at some point. But Mark just refuses and starts acting out and then gets sedated with the injection. And it seems like whenever something goes wrong in the therapy session, that's when he flips back to this other scene with him and Steven together.
Yeah.
Facing Taweret. And here's where she tells them that they're dead.
Yeah.
We already talked about her in the previous episode a little bit and what her role in Egyptian mythology is. But I loved seeing her as this kind of welcoming bureaucrat with
Yes.
her little cards that she had to flip through to find the right things to say.
Well, yeah, it seems like, that they're really playing into the idea that because no one really practices this religion anymore, that, she hasn't had a visitor in a long time, and she's has to brush up on her on her index cards, on her, her operations and her protocol. So I loved it. And plus she's that character is so well animated.
Oh yeah, the special effects on her are great.
Yeah.
She really just blends right in with the rest of the scene, which is really impressive considering the lighting situation that is going on in their current environment.
Yeah.
Special effects are really interesting to me, so I watch like Corridor Crew and stuff like that. And so I know a lot of times that one of the ways to get around having to deal with making the best special effects possible is they'll darken the room. If everybody's in the dark, then you don't have to see all those details,
Right,
of like, the skin stretching and, moving.
it was like every special effects fight scene in the early 2000s was dark and rainy.
Yeah, exactly. And, they still will do that to this day, is to put it in the dark have it happening at night so that a lot of the fine detail can just fade into the darkness. But they're in this brightly lit with the fluorescent lights in the ceiling. And so you can see every little movement, her ears wiggling and, her mouth and lips making shapes to form words. And it all matches up and is really well done. So I was very impressed with that.
Same, especially for television. You kind of expect Marvel to have a certain level of quality on the big screen, but I was always concerned when they started doing these shows if they were going to continue that on. And I think out of all the shows, this one has really been the most ambitious in regards to special effects and different locations. And, so it's cool to see that they're still firing. I mean, I don't think every effect in the show has been amazing, but this one was certainly very, very good.
Yeah. Another thing I enjoyed is something that the first time I ran across this concept was back in Piers Anthony's Incarnations of Immortality series. Taweret mentions that this is an afterlife. Yeah. It's not the afterlife. Yeah. And so the concept that basically whatever you believe in is going to be your afterlife.
Right.
Is something that, like I said, I kind of ran into that reading the Incarnations of Immortality series by Piers Anthony back when I was probably too young to really have been reading those. But I like that concept. And she name checks the ancestral plane.
Yes.
Which is the afterlife that we see in Black Panther. So it was a nice acknowledgement of that shared universe and saying, yes, you can have this afterlife, you can have that afterlife. These are all possibilities, and it leaves the door open to add even more mythologies later.
Right.
And just say they all exist together, and whichever one you most strongly believe in, that's where you go after your life is over.
Yeah. What I think was interesting is that they've come out and said this show is pretty standalone in terms of the Marvel universe. Mm-hmm. And they've stuck true to that, but this was world building that is pretty substantial for a show that's on its own out there. They've really just defined a whole subsection of the Marvel universe, at least on the screen. So I thought it was very interesting and kind of cool.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Now, through this whole thing, Mark is very skeptical of what she is telling them. She lets him know that they've died, and Mark is saying, no, this can't be right. Steven is open and accepting of it, but Mark continues his skepticism throughout this whole thing and is like, no, Dr. Harrow's right. This is an organizing principle. this is a delusion, and if I walk through these double doors here, I'm gonna see a room full of patients with Crawley there yelling out bingo numbers, and he does, and that's not what he sees.
No, not at all.
We get the first shot of the ship that you had mentioned in the previous episode.
Yeah.
And we see that it is sailing through the sand dunes rather than the ocean.
And believe me, I was really pleased to see this because last episode, the idea of that ship, I just kind of pulled that out of the air, and I got pretty close with it, actually.
Yeah, it's
have the.
It's funny because I do a lot of the editing for this show after I've watched the next episode at least once, because I'm a procrastinator and that's just the way I work. So I was listening to the episode and editing and going, oh, yeah, we called that one. Yeah, he got that right. Yeah, no, I'm right there. Oh, no, we got that one wrong. So when you brought up the boat in the previous episode, I was like, yeah, he nailed that one.
That was, I think, the one I've been most pleased with, because I thought this is a stretch, man. They're not on a boat, but then they were on a boat. It was fun. I love the, that it's sailing through the sand dunes, and it's the process of traveling to their end destination and having to revisit their lives. It was a cool concept.
Yeah. And it brings back the whole, it's been mentioned a few times, and it's one of the things that I knew about Egyptian mythology even before having watched any of these episodes. The concept of having the weight of your heart balanced against a feather.
Or in this case, their hearts.
Yes, which is a little unfair, but kind of not, because they're the same person. But if you look at it from an actual physics point of view, having two hearts is heavier than one heart. So
she does make a comment, though, about at some point about that they're not full.
Yes, that's coming up pretty quickly here.
They're also disturbingly gray.
Well, I looked at them and it looked like they were made of stone, like they were carved out of ivory or something like that, rather than being dried out muscle or anything. So
I definitely went the other way. I thought that, gosh, they're really dead. They're not only dead, they're desiccated. But what a beautiful scene, though. The dunes and the sunset and the lights from the boat.
Yeah.
Really good.
Absolutely gorgeous. Now, you said that Taweret tells them that the hearts aren't full. They have to balance things out. But before she does that, Mart suggests that they basically hijack the boat.
Yeah, there's two of us and one hippo. You can't hijack the afterlife.
No. But Mark seems to always take the most direct approach to problem solving.
Definitely.
Whereas Steven is more willing to kind of go with the flow and says, no, let's play this out. Let's balance our scales. And so they go along with Steven, and they go in and they start looking through the memories. They look in a few doors and we see the fight from the end of episode 1. We see Steven and Khonshu turning back the sky. So we get the idea that these are memories. And then we see a new one that we haven't seen before. It wasn't from one of the past episodes, where one of them is standing out on a street and drinking from a flask. And Steven's like, do you remember this? And Mark's like, oh, whatever, it's a street. I've been on lots of streets. Mark is still very much trying to hide what the truth is at this point.
Yeah.
Which, as we'll see later, if he had actually gone along with this and actually started confronting things earlier, maybe they would have gotten their scales in balance sooner and not had the troubles that they had at the end of the episode.
Yeah, agreed.
But before they go any further, they're distracted by the sound of a screaming boy and run towards the sound and end up in a room full of dead people. As Steven points out, a cafeteria of the dead just sitting around.
Very disturbing.
Yeah. And we quickly realize that these are all of the people that Mark has killed during his life.
Most of them may be in the service of Khonshu. It's kind of the impression I got.
Yeah, I would say the majority of them, but we know that he was former military and was a mercenary before becoming Moon Knight. So I wouldn't be surprised if at least a couple of them were from that time before.
Yeah.
But he does try to say that these were bad people that I killed protecting the travelers of the night. But one of the people in this room is the boy. And, you know, this is a really, really tough episode, emotionally speaking.
Yeah.
And here's where we really start to dig into Mark's history and learn just how damaged he was.
Yeah.
Because they follow the boy, and Stephen goes through the door and he's in the backyard in their childhood home.
Right.
Now we find out who this little boy was. Mark's brother.
Yeah.
Randall.
Yeah.
Or Roro is he. Yeah. And Stephen watches as the kids head off to this cave that apparently they've played in many times before, but the rules are you don't go in when it's raining. Now, before the kids go in, or right about the time that the kids do go in, even though it is raining, Stephen steps on what we see is the skeleton of a dead bird.
Right.
And obviously that bird is supposed to remind us of Khonshu.
Yeah.
And so it makes me think, or at least wonder, if Khonshu was already setting things up.
Sure.
Way back then.
It seems like either, he had a presence there on a subconscious level, or, that bird stuck in his memory and his projection of Khonshu took on, the image of that skeleton. But, it seems like they're implying that Khonshu might have had some sort of a presence early on.
Mm-hmm. And way back in, I don't remember if it was episode 1 or episode 2, we talked about in the comics how Mark had his first, we learn in later stories that he had his first dissociative identity break when he was a child.
Yeah.
And it was at that moment that Khonshu kind of picked him out and said, I've got stuff for you to do when you're older. The gods in this story seem pretty manipulative, so it would not surprise me to find out that Khonshu actually helped arrange this, maybe brought the storm on, or something to that effect.
If what we've seen is the real world in the first few episodes, then Harrow even mentions that, well, that's all he can do is basically rattle the cages and blow the wind. But it seems like starting a rainstorm would be well within his power.
Mm-hmm.
And, if he's affecting the course of Mark/Stephen's life at that point negatively, especially Roro's life, that's certainly possible.
Yeah. And we get basically the death scene of Randall, of Roro. Stephen is trying to rescue them, but obviously this is a memory, and so he has no power to influence or change anything. So we get that scene, which is obviously really rough.
Yeah.
In the meantime, Mark is still in the asylum hallway and is trying to get back in to reunite with Stephen. And I noticed that while Stephen is seeing this, Mark seems to also be experiencing it in his head. And it's like, it's just a memory, ignore it, you can deal with it.
Yeah. When he sees that image of his mother as well behind the door, that's disturbing for him.
Mm-hmm.
He definitely is not able to, even as an adult. And obviously this is wound throughout all of his problems, but they do a pretty good job of showing that he's not able to face this. Mark seems to be pretty steady, and like you said, he deals with things pretty directly. But in the case of this memory and this part of his life, how his mother treated him, he can't face it. He would rather be in the asylum than, or even dead than facing these memories.
Yeah,
I thought they did that very well of showing the character being resistant to the point of almost being, well, even possibly being self-harming later on in the episode. So
yeah, I have more thoughts on that, but I have a specific point at which I want to bring them up. So
sure.
Continuing on in the story, Stephen sees the death and then goes into the next room, which is the Shiva that the family is sitting for Randall. And this is the first confirmation that Mark/Stephen are Jewish.
Yeah. Which
is something that carries over from the comics, and something that especially the Jewish fans were hoping to see, that representation would be there. I remember certain news sites saying there's nothing in this show that shows him being Jewish at all, and people kind of complaining about that, and turns out those rumor sites were wrong.
Yeah. And I'd heard some of that scuttlebutt as well. And, they hadn't made it a big deal, but, I think they did it the right way because, most people don't go around talking about their faith unless it's a situation that calls for a discussion of the faith. So,
right. Yeah. Unless you're evangelical or something and are the kind of person
absolutely.
who brings it up anytime you can.
Right. That's if outside of that, if you're not zealous in that way, then this was the natural way for that kind of information to be revealed.
Mm-hmm.
It never feels shoehorned in.
It doesn't feel forced.
Never feels, no.
Yeah, it's very natural, but it's nice that they do bring it in a natural way and do confirm that we do have a Jewish superhero in the Marvel Universe.
Yes, agreed.
So Mark and Stephen at this point do get to reunite briefly as Mark comes into this room where the Shiva is taking place. And, we get more of this kind of dreamlike logic where Stephen runs upstairs following his younger self and ends up back in the same room, but at a different point in time. The first time we see them in this room, they're sitting Shiva, and the mom blames young Mark for the death of Randall. And then young Mark runs away, Stephen runs up after him, and then they end up back in the same room, but now it's a few years later, and Mark is celebrating his birthday, but the mom refuses to come down. And we see that the father, at least, is still there for him, but mom is getting more distant and just refuses to even acknowledge Mark's existence, basically, at this point.
How sad.
Yeah. And then they do it again with Stephen running upstairs, and now it's another memory of mom actually making it sound like Mark did it on purpose.
Yeah.
That he was jealous of Randall and basically wanted all of the attention for himself, and so killed him rather than it being an accident or unfortunate circumstances or whatever you want to call it. Which, that is just the worst thing a mother can say to a child. I can't even imagine the kind of pain that would cause somebody.
Yeah. Also, it's worth noting that if any character that is holding a glass of alcohol and carrying around the bottle has a problem, and
yes,
that's a good shorthand to you are way gone in this moment.
Yeah, yeah. She obviously never recovered from the death of her son and buried herself in alcohol and self-loathing and loathing of everyone around her, and
in particular her son.
Yeah.
Tragic.
Yeah. And there's some really interesting cuts in here where once again Stephen goes upstairs, but before he can get into the bedroom, Mark forces him away from there and he pulls him, and now they're out on the street. And so, you get this very dreamlike logic where you can end up from one place to another just by pulling someone away. And here's where we see Mark basically leaving home as a young, probably 17, 18-year-old kid.
Yeah.
Being like, I just can't deal with this anymore. I'm guessing this is when Mark joined the military.
It certainly makes sense.
And again, this whole time, Mark is fighting Stephen. Stephen wants to see all of this. He wants to understand what is happening. He wants to balance the scales. But Mark is fighting him every step of the way. And so when an important moment comes and, an opportunity comes to actually face it, Mark tackles him. And now, instead of Mark being a child, now it's Mark as an adult in the desert, and here we get the Moon Knight origin story.
Yeah, I know only basically through you telling it through the course of our podcast, but it seemed they stuck very close to the comics.
Yeah, I would say so. The only minor differences I could see was in the comics, there was a bit more of a time distance between when the archaeologists were killed and when Mark ended up bleeding in front of the statue of Khonshu. In the comics, there was kind of an unnecessary, he was in the desert and he found Marlene, and Marlene brought him to other people, and those other people took him back to the tomb and laid him in front of the statue of Khonshu. And so it got a lot more convoluted for, what I think is no real reason.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a good adaptation here where they simplify it and it all happened at the same time, basically.
Yeah.
And so that was one difference. And then the other minor difference is that Khonshu's tomb is underground in the comics, whereas here in the show, it's obviously above ground in this.
Like a temple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But otherwise, they even call out Bushman as the mercenary who went too far.
Yeah.
Which I mentioned him in one of our previous episodes, and I was kind of surprised that they actually call him out.
Yeah, I know you were wondering if they do that. They went there.
Yeah. Now, they don't show him, so they at least avoid the problematic appearance that he has in the comics with the white face paint and the metal teeth. They make him a very kind of stereotypical wannabe African warlord sort of thing. And so the fact that they don't show him at all means that you can bring him in a later show and make him more modern and less problematic.
Yeah.
So I think they did a really good job of picking and choosing exactly what bits and pieces from the origin they wanted to stick true to and what was changed for bringing it to the cinematic universe.
Yeah. Now in the show, he mentions that Bushman was his former CO in the military. I'm guessing that was an invention for the MCU, or was that from the comics?
I don't remember if they had a relationship beforehand. At the point where the origin story happens, they're both mercenaries. And that seems to be the case here as well. But I don't think they had a previous relationship in the military together. I think he was just one of many different mercenaries that Mark worked under during his time as a mercenary.
That's kind of what I figured. You take a shortcut and give them a relationship, a history, and then you can tell that backstory and have more stakes when you really want to finally address it.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's another one of those adaptations that makes a change for the better and gives more stakes, gives more story opportunity, just opens it up to future stories. So well done on the writer's part on this episode.
The whole episode,
yeah.
really.
Oh yeah, the whole episode.
Fantastic.
But
Yeah.
but very specifically in their adaptation of this moment from the comics.
Yeah.
So we see all the dead archaeologists there, and then we get to see Mark crawling into the tomb, and it looks like he's going to kill himself rather than bleed out slowly, and gets offered an alternative.
Right. A deal with the devil,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Maybe not even so to speak. Nearly literally.
Yeah.
We've called out how much of a jerk Conchu is, although we've used stronger language in the past.
Conchu's a dick.
Yes. So we have called out how much of a dick Conchu is. So it's really not that much of a stretch from dickish god to devil. And Steven even kind of calls it out at this point. He says, you know, he was manipulating you. He really didn't give you much of a choice.
And he saw that you were broken and he was going to use that to his advantage.
Yep.
And if, like you say, if we find that he has a presence at the death of his brother, I mean, that's goes far beyond manipulation. That's something much more perverse and evil. So if Moon Knight goes on and, and has a second iteration, they certainly have some fertile stories that they can tap into.
Yeah. And that's something they've been doing in the comics quite a bit, is make the relationship between Khonshu and Mark much more antagonistic, where he kind of accepts this is what he has to do, but he doesn't always agree with what Khonshu wants. And so they kind of butt heads throughout various stories.
Yeah.
Now, there was something here that felt like maybe a scene got deleted or something. Because after we see the memory of Mark accepting the deal with Khonshu and becoming Moon Knight at that moment, we hear some baboon noises, and then it cuts to them walking back out onto the deck, and we briefly see some baboons like coming out onto the deck in front of them and then coming out onto the railing. And so it felt kind of disconnected. I didn't understand what the baboon noise was there for and why that happened. So I wonder if there's something that was cut out that has the baboons like lead them back, kind of saying, we need you to be back here on the deck.
There must be a reason that the baboons are still there, because, and I have to admit before I say this, that I didn't notice this. I've been through this episode twice, and I felt like I was paying pretty good attention to most of it. And for some reason, I missed this transition weirdness. But if that's the case, then there's got to be a reason that they're there. It would be easy enough for them to remove them.
Yeah.
From post. There's got to be a reason for their presence. But it seems very jarring that they'd be included.
Yeah, it didn't really make sense to me, and so my only thought is there has to be something that got cut for time or something like that, or maybe the effects weren't quite there on it. There has to be something that gets them from that moment in the memory to them on the deck that we're missing.
Yeah.
Because it just seemed really odd. But we do get them onto the deck now, and we see these like meteorites, or at least that's what it looked like to me, falling out of the sky onto the desert. And Tarouet tells them it's unbalanced souls who are being judged before their time. And that lets Mark and Steven show her how serious things are and lets them convince her to take them back to the land of the living.
If the scales balance, it seems.
Right. Yeah, you still need the scales to balance, but she at least starts the process by turning the boat around, or not necessarily around, but turning it towards Osiris's gate, which is apparently the only way to get back to the land of the living. But in order to do that and be alive again, they mention that they've got to get some sort of message to Layla to free Khonshu so that he gets his power back, because otherwise he'll just be back in a body with a bullet in it and just die again.
That's no good for anyone, right?
No. So I'll be curious to see how that's handled next episode.
Yeah.
How do you get a message to the other side?
Well, and you and I have talked about there's a lot to be done. That, you know, if Layla needs to get a message from the underworld to free Khonshu, and then she would need to go to the temple and find a way into the temple and free Khonshu.
Yeah.
And then Khonshu would need to let Mark back into his body. And then they'd have to deal with the fact that Ammit has been released, and it seems like a lot of stuff for final episode that is, I just read, going to be
The
either
shortest.
the shortest, or the second shortest.
I read that too.
When they said, the article I saw said Moon Knight finale episode sets time record, I thought, it's going to be long because they've got a lot to do. And then I read it, and it's going to be the shortest one. And I'm like, I don't know how they're going to do this. But, it's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah, it really is.
I worry about it because, this episode, it was so good kind of in a kind of a standalone sort of way. I mean, I know that we push the narrative forward and we push character development forward in a major way, but this is one of those episodes, in a longer show that you'd kind of like, we could kind of take this out of the narrative of the plot and you wouldn't really affect the plot. But this is so pivotal. It almost feels to me like someone went, this is the story I want to tell. And we just watched it. And now we got to wrap up the surrounding stuff. And it's almost a little bit of an afterthought, It definitely will be interesting. I'm nervous about if they're going to stick the landing on this one. I hope they do.
Yeah, me too.
But I'm jumping ahead. We're still got episodes left. We got a whole bunch of the episode left.
Yeah, this is true. Because even if they get to Osiris's gate, they still need to balance the scales.
Right.
According to Taweret. So they head back in. And again, Mark is just fighting every step of the way. He doesn't want to deal with what happened in the bedroom. And he starts hitting himself and screaming. And then we cut again back to the therapy session. And this moment here is when, in my mind, I started seeing Dr. Harrow as a positive force, because he was saying, you have to deal with this. You have to talk about what happened, and you have to connect with Steven, and you have to open up to him.
Yeah.
He was no longer saying all of the superhero stuff is a delusion and anything like that. He no longer felt like he was trying to trap Mark there. It felt like he was actually doing his job at this point and trying to get him to talk about the source of his trauma.
Yeah, that weighs heavily into how I perceived him through the whole episode. And to play the devil's advocate, there's definitely ways to spin this so that he's the bad guy. I just never got that sense, and I agree with you that this scene went a long way toward feeling like he was a helper, not someone with a malicious intent.
Yeah, and so after Dr. Harrow talks to him about opening up, we cut back to the bedroom. We finally get to see what happened in the bedroom, where young Mark is sitting on the floor and the mom is banging on the door, basically saying, you're gonna get it. And this seems to be when Mark has his first disassociation.
It's interesting through this part because it's back in episode 1 of when we were talking about it, and we were talking about, it's Mark or Steven, the primary. You made an excellent point that normally you bring out a stronger personality to deal with things that you don't feel like you're capable of handling.
Yeah.
And it's interesting in this episode that he brings out a softer personality, and it still feels like there's a third personality that we haven't seen, or maybe we have, we just didn't know it, which would have been, someone tougher would have been much more suited to this kind of abuse.
Yeah, that's what I really get confused about in this scene.
Yeah.
Is he has that dissociative episode and becomes Steven, but his mom's still yelling, and she comes in and is going to, we don't see it, but I have to assume that she physically abuses him in some way at this point.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And if Stephen is the personality that is created so that he can still see his mother in a loving way and still have a relationship with her, even if it is fictitious, it seems like he wouldn't be the personality you'd want in this moment.
Yeah, exactly. How can Stephen still believe his mother is a good person if he's the one that is active when the abuse happens? So
Right.
that confuses me. And so, maybe we will see that the third identity comes out when the abuse happens. That might be something we learn in the next episode, in this last episode.
And it would 100% make sense for those that, to act in that way, where it's okay. Stephen's going to be the one that can still have the rose colored glasses and kind of see the world as a beautiful place.
Mm-hmm.
And Mark kind of sees it as it is and is kind of, like you said, very direct. And then you've got this other personality, whether it be Jake Lockley or some other, whatever, they definitely haven't been sticking to the personalities. I don't know if they'll stick to the names or not, but this other personality, that rough and tumble caustic personality, man, that's the one you create that's going to take the abuse and not give a crap about it. And, that's the dude that you want in that space. So I thought this episode was great, but I do feel like it's a weird choice to make, like you have somebody, and the little English kid cleaning up the room when the wolf is barking at the door,
Yeah, I agree. It's confusing. Hopefully it will get cleared up in the next episode. But for now, it does finally confirm what you've been suspecting all along and what I thought was not the case, but that Mark is the primary identity and Stephen is one of the alters.
Yeah, but not to beat this dead horse, but even though I technically got it right out of the two of us, you called the right situation. Like it would have made some more sense if, Stephen was the primary and then Mark came out in that moment.
Yeah.
That would have made more sense thematically. But, so I feel like you called the right situation. It's just that they've kind of flipped the personalities in a weird way.
Yeah.
But I'll still take my pizza.
Are you a Domino's guy or Papa John's?
we'll talk offline.
Okay. All right. Well, speaking of talking, Mark and Stephen talk here back in the asylum hallway after the memory completes. Mark is basically like, look, I let you have a normal life. I let you believe that your mother loved you and that she's still alive. And so we get another revelation here that you were right on and I was wrong. Stephen's mom is dead. Or Mark's, well, they're both because they're the same person. Yeah, Mark's mom is dead. And apparently he's been delusional when he's making these calls.
Well, and here's the thing on this one too. Again, I'm going to take the technical win, but I thought he was talking to a voicemail or something. And I do think there was a level of delusion. But if you see in the scene where he calls her after the Shiva, which we haven't really talked about yet,
right?
You can actually see that the phone isn't even on. Like he's not even on a phone call. So it's a level of delusion well beyond what I thought. You mentioned, hey, he's pausing, like he's having a conversation. And I was like, I don't know. But he is, because in his mind, he is having a conversation. He's not even, there's nobody on the other end, not even an answering machine, which is kind of what I thought.
Yeah.
So even the times where I feel like I've gotten it, it's not in the way that I thought I would have gotten it,
Yeah. And it still doesn't answer the question of who sent the postcard.
Well, he probably is sending them to himself. There's that shot in the first episode of the postcards in the gift store. He works in the gift store. He's probably just reinforcing his delusion every day.
Yeah, probably.
I had no idea it was so deep that he was just having non-existent conversations. So at that point, I feel like anything's game, write yourself postcards, send yourself presents, whatever it takes to kind of reinforce that fiction that you've created.
Mm-hmm. But I wonder if it's Mark actively doing that, or if it's Stephen, but under some sort of delusion, or the third personality who takes care of that.
Well, after this episode, I feel like it doesn't need to be anybody. Like Steven's shown us he's fully capable of doing it himself.
Yeah.
He's perpetuating his own delusion. And, and I think Mark's letting him, because Mark's retreated as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, no one wants to deal with this. There's too much guilt and too much pain involved. And so they've all retreated in their own way.
Yeah. And Stephen retreats even further at this point. He refuses to acknowledge that his mother is dead. And so Stephen, for the first time that we see at least, ends up in the therapy session.
Yeah.
With Dr. Harrow. And again, Harrow is being a good therapist here and confronts him about his mother's death and basically says, well, let's call her. Here we go. And we've talked throughout this whole series on Oscar Isaac's performance.
Yeah.
And this is one of those scenes that is amazing, is so well done, where he starts out in denial and his acceptance as he breaks down and is crying and says, my mom's dead. Just so moving.
If he doesn't get recognition for this part, it's a crime, because he has played every gamut of every aspect of every little tick of a human being. Mm-hmm. And all the way from him breaking down after the Shiva to the phone, the moment where he pulls the yarmulke off and like slams it into the ground and then kind of cradles it. Holy cow, man. This is all really, this stuff has impact. And he's playing such a wounded human in this show. It's definitely far afield for a Marvel show, but they certainly have tackled grief and loss and wounded creatures in this phase 4, especially on TV.
Yeah. There's a lot of parallels you can draw between WandaVision and this, especially.
Yeah.
In that they're both dealing with grief by covering it up with some sort of delusion. And while Wanda's was powered by her magic, Mark's is dealt with in a much more human and realistic way, where this break in consciousness, this break in identity, because Mark can't deal with his mom's death, he switches back to Stephen and quote unquote calls her and says, oh, I'm lost. Oh, silly me. Don't know where I am.
And you know, like I mentioned, you can see that it's just his phone screen. It's not, he's not speaking to anyone. And that's just shows how deep he's gone in this moment.
Yeah. But current day Mark and Stephen do now finally talk it out. And this is where Stephen says, look, it wasn't your fault. You were a kid. What you went through was horrible. What your mom did to you was horrible, and it's not your fault. That gets the scales nearly balanced, it appears. But unfortunately, it looks like it might be too late, because, there's that shaking and they say, it feels like we've come to a stop. And sure enough, they've almost reached the gates. But because the scales are still unbalanced, the unbalanced souls from the Duat come out of the sands and up onto the boat to take Mark back down with them.
Sand zombies.
Very similar to The Mummy from the Brendan Fraser version of the film. They're solid, but when you punch them, they break down into sand.
Yeah.
And also, I like the detail of these specific ones being some of the same people from the cafeteria, that they're some of the people that Mark killed.
I did not notice that.
Oh, yeah. He specifically calls it out, too. He's like, oh, Gabon, LA, New York. I remember you guys. Let's do this.
I remember him saying that in the cafeteria. I just didn't know that they noticed that they made a reappearance in this scene.
Yeah, no, he says it on the boat deck as well.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So, yeah.
I don't know how I missed the couple of things after 2 viewings, but I guess a third is in order.
Oh, darn. You have to watch it again.
It's such a good episode. I'm looking forward to it, actually.
Yeah, me too. And this is really our only action sequence in this entire episode, which I'm totally okay with. I know some people have felt that there has not been enough Moon Knight in the Moon Knight show,
Yeah.
but I'm totally okay with it being a more cerebral and talky show.
I am as well. I think it's a very big swing for Marvel. It's very risky. I mean, maybe less so on Disney Plus, but if you think of how little Moon Knight we've had in the show so far, that's a bold choice to say, yeah, let's go forward with this story.
Yeah.
Because that's not what people are expecting for sure.
That's definitely true, but I think they're doing really well with it.
Yeah. I will reserve my judgment for the finale. Because I mean, like I said, I feel like this episode, I would say this episode is one of the best pieces, maybe the best episode of television, maybe running up against Wanda's penultimate episode.
Mhm.
But as far as storytelling, man, this is a strong one, but it's so isolated. It's hard for me to judge the show as a whole yet, even with the strength of this episode. It feels like it kind of takes it away from where it needs to go narratively. So man, I'm really torn on how I feel about everything right now, but I can say for 100% that this episode was great.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. But like I was saying, this is kind of our big action sequence here in this episode, with first Mark fighting them off, and he's doing okay at first. I like that Steven helps him out at first by just steering the boat to knock people off balance. But then Steven has that moment where he's like, okay, if Mark's got this, we're the same person.
Yeah.
I've got this. And so the personalities are coming together. They're accepting one another and what each brings to the table. And so Steven kind of brings out his inner Mark and goes to town on these guys.
Yeah. And I really hope that we see in the last episode a moment where Mark has to bring out his inner Steven, to where we see that those two things have kind of coalesced in a way.
Yeah. So, like I said, Steven goes to town on them, but unfortunately, there are more, and another one comes up from off the boat and grabs Mark and looks like he's going to throw him overboard, but Steven makes the sacrifice play, and he and that other soul fall off together. And Steven becomes frozen in sand, as Taweret told them they would happen. But that allows the scales to finally balance, and the episode ends with Mark in the field of reeds.
Yeah. So we get the moment, which is heartbreaking, of seeing Steven frozen in sand.
Yeah.
Basically a part of his personality that's no longer needed anymore thematically. And then also very powerful to see Mark standing in that field. What confuses me a little bit is what happened to, hey, if the scales balance, we're going to take you through the gate of Osiris. Now he's in a field and the boat's gone and Tawaret's gone. So I'm sure, we'll figure it out at the beginning of the next episode. But I did find that a little confusing, because it felt like we were going one place and ultimately ended up in another in a way.
Right. I agree with you on that. It is confusing as to why he's in the field of reeds instead of going through the gates of Osiris. But as we mentioned earlier in the episode, he still has no way to be alive when he returns. So It may be that he's in the field of reeds for now until that changes. This is a waypoint for him until whatever needs to get done.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. It was a very striking final image, but it also just a little confusing, because it wasn't where I thought our destination ultimately was supposed to be. Overall, I can't say enough about how much I liked this episode. I just real deep and powerful stuff from the comic book company that's putting out some great entertainment.
Oh yeah, Disney/Marvel. They have not put out a bad product. They've had some singular episodes that have not been as good as they could have been. They've had a couple of movies that were maybe a little below average, but even their worst movie has had fun action and some funny moments, and just they have been the most consistently good at storytelling since the MCU started. I'm completely impressed, and I think that all comes down to Kevin Feige.
Oh, absolutely. And that's my concern is, there's so many projects now you hear more and more about, oh, we were shooting this, but Kevin never was able to make it to the set. He is busy and he's relying a lot on other people. So I'm hoping they maintain that level of quality, that he's training the people under him to be the team that's needed, because, ultimately it can't, if you're going to be expanding it, you can't be resting on the shoulders of one guy.
That's true. But so far, he seems to be juggling everything successfully. So, but wrapping up this show, we've got a lot of stuff to get resolved in these last 45, 50 minutes, however long it's going to be. But as always, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll talk to you next week.
Sounds good, buddy.
That wraps up this week's deep dive. Thanks as always to John Mulhall for joining me. And don't forget you can find out more about him and his literary work at johnmulhall.com. We'll continue our talk about Moon Knight next week with the final episode. But I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, either on this show or on topics you want discussed in future episodes. Please send any and all of those via email to welcome2geektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, welcome to, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link if you'd prefer to remain anonymous. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcome to Geektown or Twitter @GeektownPodcast. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, come join the Patreon at patreon.com/welcome to Geektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show so we can all tell them,
welcome to Geektown, population, us.
Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onsted. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material, their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.